starting the conversation. Welcome to the SPSJ podcast. Following on from our previous episode about Theology of Place and what it means to talk about the place in which we live, this episode explores the second part of our interview with Rev Dr Alison Walker, exploring this theme from a geographical point of view.
So it's wonderful to be back again for another episode of our podcast. And in the house we have Andy and Heather and Grace and myself, Luke. And if you listened to the last episode, we had the first part of the Rev Dr Alison Walker's discussing her work on the Theology of Place. But really, probably the highlight of the episode was when we discovered that Grace has a secret love of bonnets. And if you just
secretly
if you left the last episode feeling like you wanted more bonnets, well, don't worry, there's a lot more bonnets to come later in the episode.
I'm looking forward to it.
Of course you are.
I'm going to come to the our next recording session for our next episode in a bonnet now.
You've made all kinds of promises there.
I have, I know. It's all right, they can't see me.
So maybe we should just recap a little bit on what happened in the last episode, because it might have been a while since you listened to it. Anybody want to do that?
Yeah, so we were thinking, weren't we, around we decided to make it a two-parter, this Theology of Place. And part one was all about this kind of more of a sacramental approach, wasn't it, as Alison was calling it, and thinking around all sorts of conversation, weren't they, really? Diversity, what is church? Big issues that we kind of covered in that first session. Really big issues, so yeah. Do go listen to it if you missed it.
Yeah, it was sort of thinking about that, how do we encounter the grace of God in place, wasn't it? That sort of, yeah.
Absolutely. And in this one we're going even deeper still and looking more at what should call the geographical side of things. And I guess when you write a PhD on something, you can never just leave it as one interview length. So lots more to discuss. Shall we have a listen?
Yeah, let's have a listen.
Dive straight in.
And then kind of the other one I call geographical. So I mentioned Andrew Ramsey before, and he's now a bishop somewhere in Wiltshire, but he wrote a book called Parish, an Anglican Theology of Place. So he's specifically thinking about how can we do a theology of place as Anglicans in England. And he's sort of wanting to it's more, I guess, kind of particularly focused on the incarnation. That's Christ in our place, Christ in our parish. And he's particularly, he describes at the beginning of his book that he's standing with the church door to his back, looking out over the parish, and kind of noticing the places in which we live. And it's interesting. So he talks about how in Colossians 1, those wonderful verses, Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers. All things have been created through him and for him. Christ himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And what Ramsey says is that we're very good at thinking about that phrase, and in Christ all things hold together, in the abstract, but not so much in the concrete. So he has this little quip where he writes, hang on, let me just find, I'm quoting him now. So the church is quite ready to confess Christ as the one in whom all things hold together, but less ready perhaps to explain how he may be the one in whom Crewe or Crowhurst hold together. So we might insert there to explain how Christ may be the one in whom Hereford holds together, or Much Wenlock or Ludlow. So that kind of sense that, how Christ is holding our places together as the kind of author of creation, and therefore that Christ is in those places as a sign of Christ's redemption of that place, but also that means that place is important, I suppose. Yeah, it's kind of a harder one, I think, to kind of, the sacramental one I think is easy for us to jump on, because again it's quite tangible, and Brumsey's wanted to do the same thing by making it tangible, but to our geography, to our locatedness, to the places we're in living. And that could be both the kind of things we consider beautiful and the things we consider maybe ugly or not, or less beautiful, kind of a road just as much as a lovely green luscious field. So there's something, I suppose it's pointing to Christ's presence in the world and his and that kind of, when I suppose what he's wanting to reflect back to the church is that in our worshipping life, we're not just attentive, are we? This is another gift of the Church of England. We're not just attentive to the congregation, but we pray for the whole needs of the parish, don't we? Regardless of whether they're in the church doors or not. And that extends both to every resident of the parish, both human and our creatures, the bees I was just referring to, or the livestock in the field. So I think for me, there's something about that kind of Christ in our place, Christ in Hereford or Christ in Ludlow. And it's not kind of claiming him as being just in this parish and not next door, because that's when it can go wrong, but saying, no, like Christ is here. And that's, when we, again, the Eucharist, the Lord is here. We're not just saying the Lord is in this church. I mean, we are, because we're in this, don't let the bishop hear me, talking like the sacramental stuff there going on the liturgy, but also proclaiming, I think, the Lord is here in this parish. He's here wanting, kind of being attentive to our needs and asking us to pray for the needs of the world. But I think, and this is why I suppose naturally I'm a bit of an ethicist, kind of thinking about the social outworking of this, that we absolutely are attentive to the needs of the world, and there's lots of places in the news right now where we're desperately wanting to pray for, but also somehow trying to think, well, what's on our doorstep that we can also be seeking to serve and help others, and notice those places in need, or maybe notice that green space that needs protection, that perhaps someone's trying to build a house on, and actually we'd really like to preserve it as a green space for our community. So I suppose it's kind of, for me, this theology of Christ in our place, thinking about kind of the incarnation, provides us a way to kind of be attentive to what's good in our places, but also where God might be calling us to serve. Where God might be calling us to serve our communities and creation and care for one another, and also then extend that kind of welcome and hospitality to those who maybe might feel on the outside of something and actually just to be invited into something.
Yeah, because that idea that Christ is holding together almost every atom of creation, every part of our mundane surroundings or extraordinary surroundings, that sort of imbues our place and our surroundings with a really deep sort of theological significance and value and importance, doesn't it? Which I find that really helpful, profound way to consider things. And I remember one of the essays that I've read in my own theological studies, which has always really stuck with me and inspired me, is where John Webster in various places talks about theology as being about God first of all, but then about all things in relation to God. And I actually, the work of theology, we can almost consider anything in creation, because by virtue of God being the creator, it has that it relates to him. And actually a proper understanding of anything, if we believe God created everything, has to include some sense of how that relates to God.
Yeah, definitely. And this where it kind of so recently, my current research, I've been thinking particularly about land, and particularly land in the Church of England. And for me, kind of sometimes how we think about land in our sort of modern world is purely through the lens of capital, like how much is this bit of land worth, can we make some money off it, rather than seeing this land as this kind of just equally holy place that God has gifted to us, that that could be this place of encounter with other people, maybe if it's kind of a precious piece of kind of a place within sort of a busy city centre, or a park maybe where someone might bump into their neighbours where otherwise they don't get to because they're really socially isolated. So seeing actually our land and our places as this gift of God, rather than just kind of as through the logic of kind of, oh, how much is this place worth through the lens of money, that's just such a kind of oh gosh, it doesn't, it's demeaning almost of actually what that place, how God views that place compared to maybe how today we might view our places.
So I mean, you mentioned before the danger of being able to think about some of these things abstractly, but actually this need to kind of locate them and root it. What does that look like for this sort of idea of the theology of place? How do we locate this? Why is it important? How do we live this out as Christians? For me on a street in Hereford, for you on a street in Bristol, for somebody else in a village in Much Wenlock.
It's a really good question. It's a really good, I mean, there's different ways that I kind of think about that question. I think about it both in the sense of, particularly because I'm a priest, so I just go back to kind of church, but I suppose sometimes kind of reinterpreting, I think particularly somewhere agricultural like Hereford Diocese, one of the things as in curacy was thinking about rogation tide, where traditionally rogation tide is traditionally about beating the bounds of your parish to determine whose parish. It's really ancient practice, but also kind of reimagining that as a way to be attentive to the needs of your parish, like the working life of your parishioners, which bit is particularly in need of prayer. So for me, that's a really kind of just something that's already there in the church calendar that we can use as a means to be really attentive to the people and creatures who are in our places, to be praying for them. But I think also that kind of attention to place sort of extends into how we're living our lives day to day. I came across this really, really good book recently called The Parish as Oasis, An Introduction to Practical Environmental Care. And it's particularly kind of thinking about how we can use the places we live and our local churches as, with regard to sort of environmental action. But there's loads of... Sorry, Paul's just come home. You can come in, it's fine. Just
you're going to star on our podcast now. No, we'll cut this up.
I'm just going to keep chatting to Luke a bit more. I'll shut the door now if that's okay, and then put the dog with you.
Okay. So maybe go describe the book again, because
yes,
we can sort of cut in after you've named it.
Hello. Sorry.
That's right. That's okay.
Yeah, the door's a bit. Okay.
I can't really hear much. The sound suppression stuff must be doing a fairly good job. So
that's good.
If you can hear stuff,
like scurrying in and out of the living rooms. All right, it's gone now. Thinking about kind of theology place for our local communities, I came across this really good book called The Parish as Oasis, An Introduction to Practical Environmental Care. And it's written by two people actually based over in Dublin, but lots of it is applicable to here, because they're kind of having this like parochial local model, particularly in how we respond to the climate crisis, but also just about how we do community together. And what I like about it is there's some really brilliant kind of suggestions that are quite they're very short chapters, so it's a really easy kind of book to pick up maybe as a church to read together, about thinking even like sharing books with one another, thinking about how we're using like our phones, how we're using our own gardens, or maybe like if we have like a shared garden in our community or our churchyards, to sort of not to bless one another really, and to bless those who we're living with one another. And then also just, I'm always challenged about, I think particularly as priests, which both of us are, we have this kind of slight luxury that we might be in a place serving for a number of years, and then we often will end up leaving, and that means there's sadness that comes with that and loss, but there's also the sense that we might move somewhere new and there might be a new challenge and new places to learn about, and oh look, there's this yummy restaurant or whatever. So I like food, but I'm always amazed, and this was always what I was bowled over by in living, even as a child growing up in Hereford Diocese, but then ministering, is that there's been people living, in Hereford, or in my case in the villages Shipton, Bourton, Much Wenlock, and for like decades, and they're like wedded to those places in a way that kind of, as clergy, maybe if we're moving a lot with our job, we might move from one place to another. Well, there are some people who've been living in a place for a really long time and are therefore committed to it in a way that sometimes we cannot be. Like, I bumped in, since moving back to Bristol, and because I have a dog, and so I walk the dog in similar places, and I bumped into this lovely lady who is still living here. She was here when I left, and she was here when I lived here before, and she's still here. And the council had cut down along the riverbank, had trimmed all the overgrown brambles, which was brilliant because then you could see the river. But the amount of litter that was left behind was just like, oh my word, goodness me. And I said to her one morning, I was like, oh, I hope they're going to come back and do some litter picking. And she was like, oh, to be honest, I'll probably just do it. And I was so like, oh, shame on me, Alison. That my response was, oh, someone else can clear up this litter. While she was thinking, oh no, I'll just come out and do that one day. I've got a litter picker and a bin bag. I'll clear up the rubbish that's been left.
Yeah.
And for me, that kind of demonstrated that commitment to a place that is a gift. Like, that lady is a gift to this community, that she's prepared to do that because she loves this place and she's lived here for a really long time. And I thought that was a real challenging encounter to kind of remind myself that when I'm sort of grumbling sometimes about where I live, maybe I should just get out and do something about it. So yeah, does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it sort of strikes me like in various ways those are all about kind of really almost being intentional about locating ourselves, of actually I don't know, I'm at that age where like lots of my peers talk about starting to put down roots, and I wonder if there is something quite sort of theologically profound, quite missional in that understanding of actually, sometimes we can talk about in sort of the Christian sort of theology, people can refer to us being aliens or pilgrims, and sort of we're not destined for this world, but actually we are in the world. And is there something quite missional about sinking in our roots and loving this place, which maybe that theology is emphasizing something different than that. We don't need to have this disconnect, and actually rather a connection is maybe even more theological than a disconnect.
Yeah, definitely. I think kind of we're still living as those who have hope in the coming kingdom, but again, that coming kingdom is a place, the New Jerusalem coming down to this earth. So I think there's kind of that tension that yes, maybe this place is not our final resting place, but yeah, it is a place that is pointing towards a hope and a place we have to come, and therefore we should pay attention to it just as much as we're paying attention to the future place. So I definitely think kind of we shouldn't be dismissive of of the places within which we live.
And it's always striking
they
to
can
me.
Be signs of redemption. That's what I'm trying to say. I think they can be signs of redemption of that future place that we hope for.
And it's always striking to me that the way that the Bible talks about that future place isn't actually as us departing and going there. It's about that place coming here, and about sort of, it's almost God, bringing together heaven and earth, rather than extracting us all out like we're being sucked up by UFOs or something. That's I find that really fascinating. I know when I moved here, one of the reasons this podcast episode theme came up was that several of us on the team are newer to Hereford, and people joke about the fact that, unless you're a third generation Herefordian, then you're new. And so there is something really profound about the sense of rootedness here, which is probably increasingly rare sort of across our country as a whole. But the other thing we noticed was that often those who are sort of, true Herefordians and sort of rooted here, could really talk quite disparagingly about the place, despite their strong connection to it. Whereas lots of us coming in new were like, well, we think it's quite nice, actually. You know, the grass isn't actually that much greener on the other side. This is pretty green grass here.
Yeah.
Do you think that just as we can treasure the places we've been deeply rooted in, we can sometimes take them for granted? And you know, what would this sort of theology of place speak into that? Do you think?
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting, because I think maybe it partly stems out of what we're just talking about before, that sometimes our focus too much perhaps on heaven being this kind of ethereal reality that we're hoping for, rather than this place descending to us. That's kind of, I don't know how much that would influence the kind of secular mindset of kind of wishing for something. Again, it's that kind of thinking, wanting for something better, when actually the thing we've got is the gift from God already. But then I wouldn't want to be too, I don't know, dismissive, I suppose. Oh, that's got me thinking about kind of how but I think there's something about treasuring those places, but I suppose that also in that treasuring can sometimes be the challenge to bring hope in a way that's currently not tangible to everyone who's living there, I suppose. That wanting to kind of for those who are maybe, you know, struggling, that we can bring something into, I'm thinking like service in the terms of like practical action, that if we're valuing this place and therefore valuing everyone who lives here, those who are struggling and those who are kind of enjoying living here, we can offer something positive for them. I don't know, I'm thinking I'm not sure it's coherent.
No, I think it's really helpful, and that brings us again into not just thinking about place as sort of individuals and the way that I get what I want from place, or the way that I exert my control over shaping the place, but about kind of bring us back into that relationship with neighbours, which is actually true, because you know there may be some people for whom, you know, life in Hereford isn't all roses and beautiful fields. It's actually you know, it can feel really difficult or hopeless, and this place isn't necessarily connected with deep treasured memories. Well, for others, maybe there is, and I guess there's that. Yeah, actually, that recognizing this link between community and place is quite profound.
I just think you know, maybe this just when the awful floods that happened in Hereford, that's both obviously incredibly horrific for so many people, but also I imagine for many people that sense of hopefully community support from those around them, from their neighbours, in a way that they might not have experienced before. That's not to say that we want the floods to happen, but you know, that kind of
well, it's a bit like during COVID, how, you know, lots of us are so used to spending so much of our lives away from our homes and then really only sleeping in them. And the amount of people I knew who, because the only people they could talk to was over the garden fence to their neighbour, or sitting on the deck chair on their porch, was suddenly realising this kind of this new localised sense of place and community, which, you know, no one wanted a global pandemic to cause that to be the case, but it was a sort of strange side effect within it, was this deeper connection with place because you weren't allowed to leave it.
No, absolutely. And I guess maybe also, you know, a kind of thinking about not just as individuals but as maybe community organizations. I think that there was a really interesting it's called like an ecumenical invitation to all the churches, but that it was coming out of the pandemic, that the church shouldn't be going into a place looking to kind of claim it for God, like in that kind of maybe rather colonial kind of language, but thinking, oh, who is already here that we can partner with to serve our place, our community best? There might actually already be an organization doing this wonderful work that could just do with a few extra people to help, or some kind of resources. So I think for me, that sense of working together collaboratively, rather than necessarily thinking we need to be the ones to come up with a new venture. Actually, there's probably stuff already happening that might be really glad of a new volunteer or a new person coming to help, that could then bless that person who's thinking, oh, I really wish I didn't live here. And it's like, actually, no, look, there might be this going on that can help kind of serve you in a way that's sort of been needed. It's funny, the grass is always greener thing, because that is something that I grew up with. My dad visited a farm when he was young, and the farmer had a painting on the wall of 4 fields in each quarter, and in each field there was a cow leaning over the hedge and munching on the grass in the neighbour of the fields. But each field had a cow doing that, but they're all eating one another's grass. And then at the bottom it say the grass is always greener on the other side. It's like, but they're all eating the same grass and in each other's fields. So there's some like farmer truth there of that saying as well, from my dad in Shropshire.
Wow, with that big piece of wisdom, I wonder if I feel like I could talk to you all day about this, because there's so many thoughts and ideas, really, really rich. So thank you so much, Alison, for all you've shared and for your sort of ongoing work and thinking in this area. I'm really hopeful that you will turn this into a book at some point, because I want to dig deeper. And you've already mentioned Willie James Jennings' book. What was the name of that book?
So Willie James Jennings' book was Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race. And yeah, that's a really a bit bigger than the other 2 parish books I've mentioned, but also very worth a read as well. Really, really good.
A bit of a meaty one if people want to really go into some sort of depth on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my goodness. Reading that book changed my life. So I would definitely recommend it, along with the Bible, but that book too.
We also recommend reading the Bible. That's always good. So, well, thank you. So that was the Reverend Dr. Alison Walker. We're so grateful to have you on the podcast. Really grateful for your time. Wishing you all the best with your future endeavours. But thank you for coming.
Thank you, Luke. Yeah, really pleasure to chat to you. Thank you.
Well, that was great, wasn't it? That part 2 of the interview of Luke and Alison there. And really, at the end there, is picking up on an awful lot of the stuff around why we decided to do this Theology of Place, of thinking, how do we speak about the place where we live? And you could just see their kind of minds were going, weren't they? And Luke, who's joined us for part 2 as well. I mean, I'm looking forward to the book that's going to clearly be written out of this. Are you?
I honestly, we had this little issue when we realised how long the recording for the interview was, but then none of us could think what to cut out, because I think the great thing about thinking about a theology of place is that it recognises the fact that all of us as human beings are located. We are in a context, we're in a place, and therefore that affects the way that we engage with everything around us. And listening to you guys discuss in the first episode, it was interesting how, you went on to quite far-ranging discussions about the nature of the church, and all these sorts of things, which in some ways sort of you're like, oh, is that a theology of place? But they springboard off because we are located. And so actually I think, so I'm glad that we decided in the end that we couldn't cut enough, and we were going to stick with and carry this on, because I think there is so many ways that thinking this through can just help us think through how does theology affect our everyday? How does theology affect the place we're in? How does God connect with everything? And so I'm very glad that you did go far-ranging in that first interview, and we get more chance to talk about it, because I could talk all day.
I think throughout the whole interview, wasn't there, was this constant coming back to the incarnation as being the key in all of this, and I think for me, one of the things that struck me was actually, if we don't recognise God in the here and the now of things, well, then you're going to miss what God's doing. Simple as that. You're going to miss out so much on life. You're going to miss out so much on what God's saying, what God might be wanting to do amongst us, because we I think, what was the phrase I wrote down? There was, when I was making notes in this episode, there's a lot of words that I don't think I was spelling correctly, because there's so much in there. But ethereal kind of, we're so good at that kind of thinking, but not good at placing it in the here and the now, which I think really came across as you guys were chatting.
So much in the Bible is about place. Like the Old Testament, just the relationship between God, the people, and the land is central in that. And then, in the New Testament we have the incarnation, like she was saying, and it would feel strange to have a faith that ignored any of that and was more super spiritual, and it doesn't matter where you are or where you're rooted. And it reminds me a little bit of the interview with Sandra as well, about, you know, as a refugee in this country as well. Sometimes we maybe think about place and belonging in a place as being, oh, you've been here for years, or you're here for a certain amount of generations. And I know in some parts of the country people can have that attitude that, you know, you haven't been here for long enough to really be a local or whatever. But actually there are people who, through various different circumstances, are just travelling through a place for a time. And how do we theologize about that circumstance as well? We can talk about loving the place that we're in, and we can talk about rootedness in a place, but actually what if you are there moving through and you know it's temporary, and there is another place actually where your heart wants to be? How do you find God in that place? It must be very mixed feelings for people. It just reminded me of that, the interview with Sandra.
It made me think, and even as you're talking there, it made me think about the idea of pilgrimage, which is something which maybe some wings of the church have a stronger sense of than others. But this sort of idea that there's something in the physical journey, the walking with God and moving through spaces, and it's kind of a more mobile version of some of the stuff you're talking about thin spaces in church. But the very nature that you're moving through ordinary spaces, but recognizing that God is in some way moving you, pulling you through that, working with you in it, is quite profound. A number of years ago, I drove down to Assisi and back.
You drove?
Yeah, I drove.
Wow.
It was a long drive, but it was amazing. I sort of took my time, and I went through the Alps, and then I went down sort of into Italy. Honestly, I was terrified when I drove off the ferry in France. I was like, "What am I doing? I can't."
It's the other side of the road.
But not just that, but I was like, "Can I cope with being on my own this much time?" And I was driving through the Alps, and every time I turned a corner, there was this amazing view, and I'd be like, "Oh, I wish I had someone here to share it with." And then it sort of hit me halfway through the drive. I was like, "Wait, I do. I'm like sharing this with God as I'm on this journey with Him." And what a beautifully intimate thing to actually only share these memories with God. But I think sort of the idea of pilgrimage and this sort of journey, and it's this slightly less rooted form. And in the interview, we ended up focusing more on some of the rooted aspects. But that passing through, that being a traveller, an alien, a foreigner, is also a significant theme in the Bible, and one which has lots of sort of significance and weight to it as well.
You know, I mean, I was thinking in what you're saying about there's something, isn't there, in a pilgrimage, that you're making a deliberate effort, you know, and actually something about being deliberate in life. Life is not just, and I think you touched on this, it's not just waiting until we get to the new heaven and new earth, which is going to be all wonderful, and recognising the gift that we've got now and being really deliberate within that. And the verse, you know, which talks about, look, draw near to God, and God's going to draw near to you. And actually recognising some of these things that you guys were talking about helps us to be more deliberate then about how we approach this life, that not just wait until we're rescued from this world. And I know many theologians have discussed this, haven't they, in the past? This real important area of this world is not evil, it was created by God. And we need to recognise that.
Yeah, one of the things I've loved about this interview is it feels like it's tied together themes from a number of our interviews and sessions we've been doing. Because, you know, you mentioned Sandra's interview, but also the one with Regina, where we were thinking about sort of the environment and stewardship. And I think one of the things which really struck me as Alison was talking, this idea of Christ reconciling all things. I mean, what did you guys think about some of that?
Yeah, well, I was about to ask you too. I mean, yes, we got this idea of Christ holding all things together as well. So there's a lot of kind of actually, how does Christ do that? What does it mean? What does it look like? Because again, like to try and get our heads around exactly what that means. And as I was listening to it, I mean, I particularly thought, you know, over the last 20 years, there's seemingly, not deliberate or anything, but there's been this real rise in kind of a Buddhist way of thinking, really, of God being within everything. And, you know, you see Buddhist statues appearing in everyone's gardens, and, you know, and thinking about the aura of energy and how it can help us and all of that. And actually, no, what does it mean that Christ holds all things together? What does it mean that Christ reconciles everything together? And, yeah, what are your thoughts kind of on what does that look like?
I was wondering when she was talking about race, and maybe this linked more to the earlier part of the discussion. She was talking about, say, the Windrush generation of Christians coming over and thinking, right, well, let's find a church and worship God in this new place that we're in, and then finding that they were rejected by those churches. And I wonder if we need to have an idea that we don't own a place. Yeah. If Christ is holding everything together, Christ owns all places. God, Christ was traveling with you on your pilgrimage, but also he was already there. So he was looking at those mountains with you, but also revealing those mountains to you and saying, oh, hi, Luke, I've been waiting for you. Yeah. And actually realizing that Christ is everywhere, realizing that Christ is the host of the place we're in. We, the people who have been here longer are not the hosts. We don't get to decide who is welcome or who isn't welcome, that we need to have a sense that we are guests, that it is a gift that has been given to us, but that we do not have the right to reject or accept people. She was talking about how sometimes you can be in a place and somebody new in their ideas might be rejected a little bit, and certainly as Christians we can do that at times, and on a bigger scale that has had implications for race as well. But I just wonder whether that idea of Christ holding everything together means seeing Christ as the host, as the owner of a place. I don't know what your thoughts are.
I think there's loads in that, because one of the things that really I'd never really thought about it so much until we were doing the interview was this idea of the ways in which we kind of so naturally seek to kind of exert our control and to be the sort of the masters of the spaces around us and to make them the way we want them to be. And I don't know, there's something quite sort of, I don't know, it challenged me about how I do that, because I thought that isn't that healthy. And as you were talking, Grace, it just reminded me of sort of, Christ actually holding everything together before we even notice it, before we're even there, and yet we sort of strut in and think that we it's all about us. It reminded me of a quiet day that I did some years ago, where we were told to get out in nature and to do something a bit different to what you might normally do on a quiet day. So I found a really tall tree, and I decided to climb the tree. And I climbed right to the top of the tree. It was probably very dangerous at my sort of age.
Because you're so young, Luke.
And I climbed this tree, and then I ended up sort of sitting in the top branches. And it was, it was a bit of a random tree in the woods, so I doubt anyone had ever climbed it before. And as I sat up there and sort of just stilled myself, I sort of saw this little micro universe of things going on around me, with ants crawling on the bark and the leaves sort of, blowing in the breeze, and lichen on the bark. And I thought, gosh, no one has ever probably looked at this, and yet God has created each bit. God knows each bit. God sustains each bit. It's the breath of God that gives life to all of this. And I've never thought about it once, and yet God has faithfully been holding this together. And I think something clicked when Alison was talking for me about, and it's sort of going back to this idea of not just being abstract, but making things concrete. I'd never considered that verse concretely. I'd sort of considered it in the way that God sort of, might relationally draw us all together, or reconcile us with himself. I'd never really related that verse to the way in which God will hold together the atoms of the universe by very nature of being the creator God, which I just found quite a profound way of rethinking about that verse. Yeah.
That sounds like you experienced the last chapters of the book of Job. God's saying to Job, look at all this stuff that goes on in the world that the humans never see. He could have added the ants at the top of that tree in that list. That we often think about the way that Christ holds all things together. We just think about humans, and we think about people. We forget about all the stuff we will never see. There will be things going on in the world that no human eye will ever see.
And the universe.
Christ is there. 100%. I don't like to think about the universe. It blows my mind.
There's something about it, isn't there? Like we often something inherent as human beings, that we always want to look at the kind of the lack of something, the scarcity of something, and we worry about it. And I mean, when you were speaking earlier, Grace, I mean, I was thinking, well, how exciting is that if we actually grasp our heads around Christ is the host and we're invited in as the guest? The one who made everything, the one who owns everything, the one who he's the host. Wow, I get to be your guest in that. I mean, suddenly any issues of scarcity go away and you just see, I have everything I need.
It just makes you think of the parable of the great banquet, doesn't it, about how the guy invites everyone and they make up their excuses. They can't come. Oh, I've got to tend to cows, and I've just bought a field, or I just got married. And then he turns around and he says, actually, I want you to invite anyone and everyone in, anyone on the streets, the lame, the beggars, they are all welcome here. And how do we, you were saying, Grace, about how do we welcome other people? We have no right to close the door on them, essentially, do we? Because it's not, we don't own this place and this space. Actually, God does, and he invites everyone in. So who are we to then say, hang on, no, you're not welcome here? And I think, especially at the moment in society, that's a massive challenge for us, not just as individuals, but as a society, as a collective. And thinking about that parable in a way, not that, like, what excuses do we make up, or what excuses do people in society make for not inviting God or being a part of what he's doing and coming into church, but actually the role that we play, that we're already in that banquet, we're already sitting at that table, but how do we then view other people who have been invited to join as well?
Recognizing that we're all fellow guests, like you know, we're no more, we're not the host,
exactly.
actually,
and I think there is something within all of this that is the secret of transformation as well. I mean, we started with thinking about how so many Herefordians speak about Hereford, and in a very, I think, derogatory way, I think, as you said, Luke, in the interview, and challenging us to how we speak, how we think about the place where God has placed us, and the gift that God has given to us. And I think I quoted this right. Alison said, "Learning to treasure where we live and bring that hope." You know that, and those verses then that I remember, I made note of a couple. In the classic Colossians 1:29, the mystery that has been kept hidden for ages and generations, but is now disclosed to all people. To them, God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And something about actually, we are the ones then who bring that hope, who bring that transformation that is only possible when we acknowledge and recognise Christ in that place.
So bearing in mind our sort of chat about how important it is to not remain in the abstract, but to kind of make things a bit more concrete, what does that look like for us? How do we do that? Because I wanted to chat more about it with Alison, almost sort of realised we were running out of time, but maybe this is a good time to raise some of those questions a bit more.
Yeah, what does it practically look like? Absolutely. And I think, I mean, we have things like social action, don't we, in the church we talk about, and I think one of the dangers is often we can either become like the kind of social services for the council, but a much cheaper version of, or we go too heavy into kind of, you must become a Christian. And I think the phrase in the interview was, we go out to claim this for Christ, which then often, in my experience, can lead to, sadly, a lot of arrogance, and we lack humility. So it's trying to get that middle ground, isn't it, of understanding and trying to meet people in their need. And there was a lot of talk, actually, wasn't there, about it's not what I can get out of this place, but actually what do I need to support my neighbours here? Are they struggling? How do I help them? But we're helping them knowing we are being Christ to them. We do both. So we don't forget in whose name we do things in, and why we do it, because we recognise what God has done for us, and therefore how we treat others, you know. I think that's the really practical, isn't it, kind of application of this, that you try and hold those two tensions together of the world and God's kingdom, and bring those two together in that great mystery that was revealed. Yeah.
I think I would add to that as well, just learning to love the place you're in is important. For some people, I feel like it comes very easily to me as someone relatively new to Herefordshire to love it. I think it's a brilliant county. But if you spend any time on the local newspaper Facebook pages and see the comments, a lot of people are very angry about some kind of bypass, it seems, but or ring road.
Is that the first time we mentioned that on the podcast? I can't remember.
I think it is actually.
What episode was that?
We don't shy away from the controversial issues.
I know. I'm going to get hate mail. But
Now Andy's back. It's
just don't mention the planters in the town square either. That's the other thing.
no, I've seen that as well. But yeah, so I'm relatively. I consider myself relatively new. I've been here a year and a half, but it didn't take long to realise the issues for people, and that's fine. You know, it's important that there are things people are concerned about. If you're concerned that the money where you live is being spent incorrectly, of course we need to be tapped into that. We need to be alert to that. But if it just becomes complaining online about the place you live, that's not. I don't think that's practical. I don't think that's beneficial. And I think that there can be a way of addressing issues that are important to you in a way that says, I love this place. I want to see the best for this place. I want to help with whatever God wants to do in this place. And you can reframe it. And so I think trying to reframe that in our minds, in our words as Christians, it's very easy to get sucked into the negativity, is an important way to set an example as well. But also, I heard something, I think it was another podcast, where somebody said that a really good way to learn to love where you live is to kind of reduce the area that you exist in, and that can be quite hard if you're in a really rural place and there aren't shops near you or whatever. But actually try and visit your local shop rather than driving out to somewhere really far away. And when we lived in Birmingham, we would drive all over the place, but actually there was walking distance, everything we needed, but we would just drive to our preferred place. But if you actually, I think they say within like a 5-mile radius of where you live, which is still quite far, you get to see the same people again and again. You get to know the people who work in different places. You're supporting more local communities. You get to know your area a little bit better.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a good practice in a world that has become bigger, where we're expected, it's back to that commuting to church thing, isn't it? We're expected to commute to work long distances, commute to church long distances. Actually reining in our sphere of engagement where we live and our place can be a good practice and can help us to love the place we're in more.
There's been a lot of benefits to technology, hasn't there? But it has meant that we are always far more spread out geographically and relationally and sort of mentally, because half our lives, we're connected with things on the opposite side of the world, and then we're sort of working in a different city where our friends are across the country. We touched in the interview on how so many people met their neighbours for the first time during COVID when they weren't allowed to leave home, and maybe actually that we quite rightly understand loving your neighbour with an abstract sense to it, but maybe we need to rediscover the very in this sort of day and age, rediscovering the very practical,
immediate sense. And that's one of the things I love about the area St James is in. It's an amazing community. I mean, it really is. The way they look after each other, and that was before COVID. If someone wasn't well or had hurt themselves, neighbours would rally around. Can I get you anything from the shop when I go? And it is, and that's what just makes this place special, really. It also means that because I get to walk to work with where I live, it also takes me longer to get anywhere because you always get stopped and end up talking to people.
I've dog sat at the vicarage a few times when Annie's been away, and I have to say it's been like a real education about the differences of being like a parish priest. Because you're aware that every time you step outside you bump into someone, and you see people, and I think so much of the parish priest role is designed around literally that kind of accidental bumping into, or just knowing what's going on your doorstep and trying to serve that.
But you don't just need to be a priest to do that. I mean, when we were in West Brom, and dog walking is great because you get to know lots of local people quite quickly, and people knew that Claire and I went to church, and even there, some of the conversations in those places that we were able to have and be there for people in their time of need. They would see us and go, you go to church, I need to talk. They didn't go to church, but they just felt, actually, you may be able to help me here. So it is. It presents opportunities of what God might be doing.
I mean, I've had that walking up the road up to the office, and on the school run for the kids at the school next door, one of the parents comes up to me, I've just had my daughter ask me a question and you're just the person to answer it.
Is it about football?
No, it was about God. And I was like, wow, well, this is a God moment bumping into me at 8 o'clock in the morning, isn't it? And it is that thing of being out and about the place where you live and being involved in the local community and being present is massive as well, because you say about commuting out to different places, and Grace, you mentioned about driving to the shops. And yes, I've got a corner shop opposite the house, but so often now, as you said, Luke, about the development of technology, we order stuff in to our doorstep, so we don't even need to leave the house.
Some of us are a bit older, we do it the old school way. You know?
Yeah. Do you actually go out to the shop?
I know.
I bet you still use checks.
But that also means that we're used to having whatever we want.
Yeah.
That's another cultural thing, isn't it? You know, in Birmingham, it's like, well, I fancy this type of food, and I know the corner shop doesn't sell that, so I'll drive over there and get it, rather than saying, oh, I just won't have it. I'll have something different. I'll use my creativity to think of something else instead. We're very much, I want this thing now, I will go get that now. Whereas when life was smaller, maybe when the bonnets were around in early parish days, you knew people better. You had to share what other people had as well.
And what people actually need now is, when they're struggling, they need to see someone and ask that question immediately. You know, I was thinking with your story, Heather, that person would not have emailed in or left a voicemail at the vicarage or waited until Sunday to come and ask somebody. They needed somebody there and then. And I think that's why it is this mystery, Christ being in us. We are Christ's hands and feet on this, in this place, right here, right now.
One of the things I did chat with Alison after the episode about, so not on the recording you just heard, was though also about the sort of the inherent imbalance of privilege that can be connected with place, and even the way that we understand and view our place. Because, to be able to move to Herefordshire, if you've got some money or something like that, it could be a very nice, enjoyable thing. But actually, your experience of Hereford could be really, really troubled. It could be even quite traumatic. And actually, the difficult connections that we have with places, or the situations where people don't have the privilege of a certain level of mastery over their space. Actually, that can also highlight some really quite significant things. It was really interesting. So Alison sort of said after the interview, was like, no, I really was very sensitive. I didn't want to judge those people who actually are, do find their place difficult, or do have a more complicated relationship. Like, who am I to judge them? I don't know their stories. And I found that really quite personally challenging. That actually, the nature of my role moving around from place to place is quite privileged. I mean, the place I'm going to next, this is the last episode I record while being here in parish before I go to somewhere where in some ways it's a very privileged. It's a bit, they don't wear bonnets there, but it's a place where they grow their own food and they have their own animals and they try and buy locally, and they can do that because there's a community working together to do it.
You can introduce the bonnets, though.
Well,
Make that your legacy.
I might wait a few months before I do that.
I can tell you who in our church makes a very good Easter bonnet if you need one.
Oh, yeah?
And it's not Claire.
We've certainly got a future episode on bonnets coming up.
I saw this. It popped up on my Facebook feed, and I think it's really relevant because a lot of the issues that we face is because of our cultural understanding in Britain, and actually other cultures around the world don't think the way we think. And I saw this, and Heather's going to be delighted because it's a quote from the coach of Fiji at Rugby World Cup.
Oh yeah, love
he was
it.
doing an interview, and he said this in it. He said, "You talk about mental well-being. Our mental well-being is being in connection with our religion, being in connection with our people, being in connection with our game. It's important to us as Fijians. That sense of connection to God, to each other, is actually significant for them.
And to place for us as well. We can add that in, the connection to the space we're in. Grace, you mentioned previously about that relationship between God, people and place, starting all the way back in the Garden of Eden, and how the development between that relationship with God and his people actually then changed about the place they were in, about being banished from the Garden of Eden, and when the relationship was broken and how we're separated. But actually you can trace that throughout the whole Bible about God's relationship with his people, with his place. And it's, if you go back and you look through the whole of even just the Old Testament, or even just Genesis, to be honest. But start small, and you can really picture God's relationship with people and place, and therefore modelling that for us.
I think a good place to end was another passage I'd seen. This again, just if we can have that hope, that confidence that Christ does indeed hold all things together, and he's faithful in all things, and will reconcile all things back to himself as well, then talking about really practical examples of actually what it means, that therefore we don't need to fear, we don't need to worry about what tomorrow brings, and all those passages that talk about that in the Bible. But I found this one from Jeremiah chapter 17 verses 7 and 8. I just thought it was a wonderful example actually what this means if we can grasp this. It says, "Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes, its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit. We are blessed, and we are called to be a blessing to the place where God has placed us." Is what we are blessed and called to be blessed to the place where God's placed us, is what I kind of wrote about that verse, that idea that when you're rooted in Christ like that, we can help our neighbours, we can help, those very real practical things then we can do, and those other things that come, not we're immune, but we can still bear fruit. Our leaves are still green,
We talk about Christ being incarnated, sort of. I always know someone who says carne sort of means meat, basically, so being like in meat. So we think of like Christ being physical, in person, in meat, in the world. But actually, that's also how God's created us. We're called to do that same sort of thing, to be the gospel in place, to be the gospel in the world.
And on that note, it sounds like a good place to end, and to say thank you to Luke for all that you have done for this place while you have been here, and that God will bless you, and that you will be a blessing in the place that you go next. So thank you.
And you've got to come back at some point, and we'll have to do a podcast on your
We'll
interview
PhD, as we've done with Alison.
Yes.
I know we've chatted a lot about it over the last 2 years, haven't we, around what you're doing, and that'd be really interesting too.
You can be our next interviewee.
I'm very excited. I'd love to come back for the podcast, generally.
The other end of the microphone. But no, thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope this episode has got you thinking, and please share this conversation with someone as we continue to learn and grow together. We look forward to you joining us again next time.